Hello and welcome to episode 178 of the Money to the Masses podcast with your resident expert as always, Damien Fay and me, Andy Leakes. Damien, welcome back. How are we doing, buddy?
I'm good. I'm very good. You?
Yeah, not too bad, not too shabby. Sitting on the new bed that I talked about last week.
Oh yeah, the new bed. Andy's just shown me the new bed. We're not in the same room, don't worry. We're not doing this in bed. We've done a podcast in a car. We've not actually gone to the bed stage yet. We're doing this
one for the future, though.
One for the future, yeah. We can invite guests, and this is done by Skype. So Andy's just shown me the amazing bed that Andy has with the TV and everything. I'm actually jealous, Andy, but
don't judge people. I'm not one of these blingy people normally, and I've never had a TV in my room before, so it's real luxury time. Why not? Every so often you get to splash out and treat yourself. Anyway, how's your week been, my friend?
Why not? Every so often you get upsold by a salesman. Why not? Indeed. I know. My week's been good. We've working on a lot behind the scenes at Money to the Masses and getting some bits and pieces together, planning. I know I said something very similar last week, but it is that stage of the year. The summer is you can take a little bit of a breather in the money world, and that's partly because everybody else loses interest because the sun comes out and they start thinking of holidays. So that's been good. And of course, Tottenham qualified for the Champions League last week, and I'm off to Wembley again this weekend because the mighty Bromley FC are in the FA Vars final. So I'm being a glory hunter because my chosen team can't actually do anything other than go to Wembley as part of a deal for their home games. So I'm going to tag along with about 10,000 Bromley residents. It's going to be a ghost town. So if you're a burglar, come to Bromley.
See, if you take nothing else from the podcast, that's what you can take away. Certainly a good money tip anyway. What have we got coming up in this week's pod?
Well, I'm going to briefly just talk about bills. This is almost a throwaway comment. It's a kind of one of the things I've been up to this week. I also want to talk about insurance versus investing. Now, I had an email from a listener, but someone who subscribes to our Money to the Masses newsletter, and asked me a question about how do you prioritise insurances like life insurance over investing, or should you? That leads quite nicely onto something to do with inheritance tax and a foolproof way to avoid inheritance tax. That was something that was sparked by an article in one of the money magazines that I happened to see this week, which I thought had a couple of good points in it, which I want to elaborate on. And finally, investing and rising interest rates. Now, if you're into investing in any way, shape or form, you may have seen that the investment market has got some of its swagger back. And at the same time, the bond market has done the complete opposite and looks a shadow of its former self, with the yield on the 10-year US Treasury rising. So what you've got to just think is the bond market is starting to show worrying signs of weakness, which sometimes translates into stock. So what I want to do is just look at that and just generally talk about how you invest in that environment.
Good. So what should we kick off with?
Let's kick off, Andy, with a short piece, just a bit of if I can do it, then anyone can. On bills and savings. Now, you know, like the plumber or the builder who will talk to everybody else about sort out their bathrooms and build their extensions. Their house is generally a tip. I don't think that really. I think there's a similar thing for people who deal with money, and I actually had a little bit more of a inward reflection on my own finances this week and started looking at some of the bills I pay, and it was sparked by me getting my pet insurance renewal. And I joked on Twitter this week that I think the insurer was actually trying to insure all 9 lives of both of my cats, because I tell you what, it was extortionate. What I did is I actually then went on and did the typical comparison, nothing outrageous, went online, looked around, compared like with like. It's quite interesting because there's such a variety when you look at something like insurance. There are different levels of cover in pets. They might sometimes have a maximum benefit. They might have a time frame in which they pay out. They may exclude existing conditions. Basically, it's hard to compare like with like. So after a period of doing that, I ended up settling for a new product, which is another pet insurance product, but the price was about a tenth of what I was paying previously. So it just shows you it's because my cats are getting old now, so the poor things are not moving beyond the boiler that much these days. But the price goes up, so shop around. That was the moral of that story. But I also therefore started to get a bit of a, like a momentum. So a rolling stone gathers no moss, Andy, especially when it comes to bills. So I started looking at some of the others, and one of them was my broadband. And I did something very different on this one, and it's normally the easiest one to haggle on. I decided to haggle, so I rang them up and just said, look, the price is too high, what can I do? I want to leave. I had no intentions really of probably leaving. And they have a whole department whose sole job is to keep people happy who are going to leave, because the cost of acquiring a new customer is multiples more of keeping one. So they end up cutting my bill and ramping my broadband up to 200 meg, which was quite incredible really. But there you go. So haggle and compare. It didn't take me too long to do it, and if I can do it, then anybody can. The other thing that I just wanted to mention is that I had some feedback on the mortgage piece we did last week. We talked about mortgages and saying about reviewing. Now, Lynn, if you're out there, Lynn, she's a money blogger, blogs under the name of Mrs. Moneypenny, and she is, I know her personally. She got in touch to say that she'd actually cut her mortgage. I'd inspired her to look at her mortgage bill, and she'd remortgaged and saved herself some money. So, I mean, that's great to have that sort of feedback, especially from somebody who you know, because it's actually personal then. You don't often get feedback from people externally. That's why I love getting your emails. But the reason I mention it is because a press release came out this week, and it struck a chord because it claimed that the research had found that when fixed periods on mortgages end, typically people don't rebroke, they don't remortgage for 42 days. They take their time, they don't get round to doing it, and that 42-day delay ends up costing them £371. Now, I didn't go into the ins and outs of the research, but it just shows that if you're coming to the end of your deal on your mortgage, then it pays to be ahead of the curve and start looking around and contacting a broker to look at the best deals for you. It's something that I'm doing in the background as well, personally. But the other point to mention is that there was an interesting question on Twitter about, will your existing lender contact you to tell you that your existing deal is up for, is expiring or up for renewal or whatever? And the short answer is it depends. Some do, some don't. So you need to be a little bit more proactive and actually note down when your deal ends, so you can stick a date in the diary and make sure that you look around and do some research. Anyway, that's bills. I'm going to go on to the insurance investing piece that I promised.
Good stuff. So yeah, you were talking earlier about insurance versus investing, and whether there was a trade-off or whether you should do both. Someone got in touch.
Yeah, Sarah asked a question at the foot of the email. I won't read her whole email out, but she said she'd be interested to hear more about my opinion on life insurances, etc., as they have life insurance, critical illness insurance, income protection insurance, and it amounts to a lot a month. And the question is it worth it? Or should they be investing the money instead? Now, I know insurance is the world you inhabit, actually, Andy, as well. So you know quite a bit about insurances. So it was quite timely that I got the question, because I've been pondering some bits and pieces in the background, the 30-day money plan, where we could perhaps take that, and the 30-day money plan book, which you can all claim free if you go to moneytothemasses.com/podcast. There was a whole part of that was trying to work out the order in which you do things. So when you're looking at your finances, it feels like a mountain, doesn't it? And you don't know which to pick off first. And I was putting down some notes this week about how you would do it. And I think the number one thing I would always say to people, if you're looking at your finances anyway, is to look at your will. See if you've got a will in place. Have you? Because obviously it's about where your assets go, but also who looks after your children if you die. So you don't want to really die without a will in place if you've got dependents. But the number two thing I would always go to is protection. So I mean protection is in insurance. That's a horrible term the industry uses that sounds like family planning, but I think that insurances are a often overlooked part of financial planning, because people want to get to the exciting stuff, the investing, how much money can I make? And the point of insurance is you need to make sure that should the worst happen, that your lifestyle won't particularly change. So in simple would you look at insurance before you looked at investing? Absolutely. I mean, if I was to run down very, very broadly, this isn't for everybody, the kind of order I would do things. I would look at wills, then insurances, then I would look at savings and debt at the same time, perhaps. Maybe then look at your bills and mortgages, and then look at budgets, because at that point you know how much money you've got. You could probably flip the budgets a little bit earlier just to see what you're spending, and there's some great apps out there that help you with that. Maybe I'll do a piece on that in the future. And then I'd look at the sort of income you're getting and any benefits that you're entitled to. And of course, then you get onto the pensions and the investment side of things, because you can't really invest if you haven't got spare cash. There's no point really trying to put money away if you can't afford to feed yourself, or in the event that you haven't got any insurances in place. And then finally, I would then get onto the inheritance tax, because we see lots about inheritance tax on the news and how much money people will have to pay to the tax man. But generally speaking, unless you're incredibly wealthy, it's one of the things that I would only start to ponder later in life. And I mean, I've just turned 40, as everyone knows, but I would even begin to ponder things like inheritance tax, because I've got to spend the money I have myself. I don't have any money, but if you're fortunate enough to have some, you've got a whole life ahead of you before you worry about the next generation. So you probably wouldn't even think about it really until you're in your 50s going into your 60s. Now, on the protection front, I think the bare minimum is you've got to have life insurance. And so that's life insurance that covers your mortgage principally. So if you die, your family aren't booted out of their home, because mortgage lenders are not charities. They're not going to sit there and think, well, that's a bit unfortunate, isn't it? Damien carked it there, that his family, look at them, bless them, but they want their money back. So unfortunately, you need to have insurances in place. So if you have that and your will in place, then people you'd hope they could grieve for you, and they would not have to at the same time have this monumental upheaval of their life. But of course, then you come on to things like critical illness. And I mean, my personal view is critical illness is expensive. It covers you, it pays out if you get diagnosed with any one of a number of critical illnesses, which can include things like lung cancer and stuff like that. So lots of cancers. And I mean, my view is it's expensive. For somebody like me, it's very expensive. If you can afford it, great. These are kind of nice to haves. But I don't know about what your view is, Andy, but I think one of the insurances that is probably undersold or under-advised on, and perhaps not known by the wider public, is income protection.
Yeah, absolutely. Income protection is right up there for me. In a lot of people's instances, it should be above critical illness, because what it's going to do is it's going to provide an ongoing income for your family if you're ill or unable to work for whatever reason. And it is really important. Actually, it's not as expensive as you think it might be, because you can you can dovetail it in with whatever benefits you get through your work. And of course, people sometimes think about income protection and think, well, how am I ever going to be able to insure myself for my full salary? That must cost an absolute bomb. But what you've got to remember is, if you're in the unlucky position where you're unable to work due to illness, then the likelihood is you're not going to be going out and spending the money in the same way that you would be if you were well. So as sad as it is, you would probably be able to survive on far less if you were in that position. And so you end up insuring yourself for less. Of course, you may well qualify for other benefits that the government may be able to provide, or your local councils. So yeah, consider income protection. There's just a few tips that I've given there, but it is something that everyone should look at. It is, again, there's a cost for it, but you can bring that cost down by making the deferred period, and that's the period in which it starts to kick in on a much longer basis. So if you have a few grand in the bank, or if you've got an investment, then take a policy out that only pays out if you're sick for, say, 6 months or more. You're going to probably cut your premiums by 60, 70, 80% if you do that. I hope that makes sense. I probably haven't gone in enough detail, but look it up. There's a really good section on Damien's site about income protection, what it is and what it does.
I mean, I think Andy brilliantly summed it up. I know it's one of Andy's fortes, but the point, as Andy says, is that you can tailor it so it can be cheaper. So just because it may seem expensive, it doesn't have to be a case of all or nothing. So you could reduce the amount of cover that you have. You can have somebody review the circumstances. So Sarah she might feel that she's got too much, and she may feel that she wants to actually reduce the level of cover. The thing is that with income protection is you're much more likely statistically to be unable to work due to illness or an accident than you are to die. And I mean, obviously that depends how old you are, but generally speaking, you're much more likely if you're working age to be unable to work. So for most people, there's been some amazing research that's gone out. It's almost frightening. It would show that most people, if they didn't have, if they were unable to work for a period of time and therefore the employer stopped paying them, if they were unable to work, they probably could only survive on what they have in savings for about not even a month. So it's one of those things that everybody should think about. It's not really advised upon, but it's something to ponder. Now, having said all that, I do think there is a place for, if you've got all your ducks in a row, you've got your bills cut, you've got the minimum protection in place, and you've got your dependents looked after, then there's nothing wrong with trying to invest for the future. And obviously I am a keen advocate of investing, but like I would say, I wouldn't do it at the expense of taking out certain insurances, certainly life insurance or maybe income protection. It's horses for courses, there's no right or wrong answer.
Good stuff. And you mentioned there about inheritance tax, and we've got a bit on that too, haven't we?
Yeah, I mean, this was sparked by an article that I read in one of the money magazines, called Money Week actually. This is a pretty decent magazine. It's a little bit, like lots of these things, they sometimes have a bit of an agenda. They push the same old stories all the time and then they contradict each other. If you had to sum them up, it would be buy gold, don't buy property, yet they seem to personally do exactly that, the journalists. So I always remember reading you'll see the editor on Question Time, and I always remember her writing a piece saying that, explaining why she bought a house. I didn't see why that was relevant. I think she'd backed herself into a bit of a hole with banging on about why it was ridiculous to buy property, and obviously it would come out eventually that she did. But anyway,
maybe her property was made in solid gold.
Probably was. I dare say she probably earns a fair penny. Yeah, so this kind of leads on nicely from the last piece. I mentioned inheritance tax right at the end of my list of things to ponder. And with inheritance tax, there are ways to try and avoid it, and there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with trying to minimise the amount you're going to pay. Now, there is the little known gift from regular income. If you give money away regularly and it doesn't impact your lifestyle in any way, then there are rules that say you can just do that. So if you had earned millions, you could give away millions if you wanted to, and there isn't any inheritance tax as long as it was regular and from income. And of course you can give things to your wife or your husband and there's no inheritance tax. Pensions these days can, with certain rules, largely passed on without inheritance tax. And of course if you give money away to people, there's a 7-year rule where their gifts are tapered for their when it comes to inheritance tax, and after 7 years there is no inheritance tax. And of course there's allowances, so if you want to give gifts at weddings and things like that, then it actually you're allowed to. But there is one way that people, when they're doing financial planning, they will use life insurance to mitigate a potential inheritance tax bill. Now the way that would work is if you took your estate, you can work out what you're worth. So you add up all the things that you have and you work out what your potential inheritance tax bill would be if you were to die. Then you could take out a policy, a life insurance policy, that pays out in the event that you die, that matches that exact amount. And then you can basically clear your potential inheritance tax bill. So it's a way of paying a regular premium to solve a problem rather than trying to move assets around or anything like that. It can be quite an easy way to mitigate an inheritance tax bill. But of course you do need to allow for inflation in all those calculations, so you end up having a policy that probably the premiums go up because it's got to allow for the fact that your assets will grow in value. And there will be something called a whole of life policy normally, which means that there's no term. It isn't going to stop after 10 years. It will just keep going until the day you die, which obviously makes it a bit more expensive. Now, what was interesting is that they did some analysis and said, look, what would happen if you were quite young and you decided, let's say you're 45 and you're wealthy and you were going to take one of these policies out and start paying these premiums to mitigate your potential inheritance tax so your dependents don't end up being stung. And of course what you would do as well is put it in trust. So when you put it in trust, it pays out and it avoids having to, it's quicker because you avoid having to wait for probate, but it goes directly to them. It's outside your estate effectively, which is why there's no inheritance tax. Now the problem is if you're 45 and they crunch the numbers, you could end up paying a premium of about $5,000 a year. So you can pay it monthly, but that's realistically what you're going to pay. But as time goes on, those premiums start to ratchet up quite quickly. So let's say you're going to live to a ripe old age. By the time you're in your 80s, you're going to be paying £13,000 a year. By the time you're in your 90s, that would have grown to 20,000. And if you're lucky enough to get to 100, you're paying probably £30,000 in insurance premiums just to mitigate the inheritance tax on your estate. Now, the problem is, can you honestly say you'd be able to afford that by the time you get older? Because don't forget, your income is going to reduce by the time you're older. So when you're in your 80s, your income levels are going to have severely reduced. So the question is, if you then cancel that policy, what happens? Well, it's worthless. It isn't got any value. So you've just been paying premiums for years, and then you've still got the same problem because you're still going to have to pay inheritance tax if you can't afford it. Now, you'd have to... the other problem you've got to do is if you'd have to hope that the inheritance tax rules aren't revised and abolished, because otherwise if they are, then you've been paying premiums for 30 years for no reason, because you don't gain anything from it. You're just trying to prevent something from happening. And it begged the question that, again, like I was saying earlier, about when it's too young to be thinking about inheritance tax, especially if you're going to start using life insurance to solve the problem. But if you're that rich and you've got that amount of money to pay those premiums, you could argue that you could have just given away that money to your dependents year after year after year, and they would have kept it. It would have had value because they would have enjoyed it. Your estate would have reduced in value, and theoretically you could have even invested that money for your dependents. So it was really I like the life insurance solution to inheritance tax. It's quite neat and it can solve it quite quickly, but also it was just an alternative way of looking at it, that, do you know what, you can give money away regularly, and if you can afford to do that, then it might be a possible way to reduce your inheritance tax but actually get some value back from the money that you'd spend.
I think that's a really good point, Damien. I know a little bit about inheritance tax. I'm certainly not an expert, but yeah, a whole of life policy, as you say, the problem is that you're paying a hell of a lot of money into a policy that, for all intents and purposes, might be worthless if they change the rules or whatever. There is another way, rather than just giving regular amounts away now. If you're that rich, you could also decide to gift a substantial amount now and take out a short-term insurance policy, just over, I think it's 7 years is the liability that you hold in terms of gifting, and that works like a decreasing term assurance policy. I think it's called Gift into Vivos. Now, it's been a while since I've advised on this kind of thing. I've kind of stepped away from it, but certainly if you've got money, or you've got relatives who are thinking about gifting money and how to mitigate inheritance tax, look into something called a Gift into Vivos policy. It's a decreasing term insurance policy that enables you to gift earlier in life. Yeah, just a thought.
Good. One of the other things I often say to people is, like, when they get to old age and they're thinking about what to do with their money, is spend it. I mean, the simplest way to avoid inheritance tax is to spend it. And what are you saving for? Because I've never met every client I've ever known, as they get older, their level of spending starts to reduce because their health starts to fail. That it's almost universal. It's just about how long they live, if they have to worry about care homes and things. But give it away or spend it, because you can't take it with you. It's the most effective way of avoiding inheritance tax. You can pay your financial advisor and all these people for very clever products, but they are going to cost you. And they will, like I say, they might clear the inheritance tax stuff, but they're costing you. So have a blowout. Go and enjoy yourself. Go around the world. That's my advice.
Yeah, there's nothing I like more than seeing a relative or a friend's relative that's worked bloody hard all their life and then spends a good few months of their retirement or whenever they decide to do it, a career break or whatever, just enjoying themselves, spending the money that they've worked hard to earn. Too right.
But the thing is, though, Andy, it's this country. We have this bizarre... We have this way of making people feel guilty about doing things like that. Do you know what I mean? It's almost like we've always got to be prudent, and we've always got to be sensible. So we always make people feel like, oh, they're going to go and do those things. It's almost like, oh, look at them, like going out and blowing their money. The fact they've been frugal their life is largely forgotten. I think we should change that. I think have a blowout when you get to the old age. I mean, hopefully I make it that far, and if I do, I fully intend to live at large.
I fully concur with you, sitting on this ludicrously expensive bed and enjoying every single night of my sleep in the last 7 days.
Before we move on, Andy, I just wanted to quickly mention 80/20 Investor. Now, 80/20 Investor is my DIY investment service. Do go and check it out. I empower and teach people how to invest their own money. The service provides data-driven fund tables. The data is driven by my own unique 80/20 investor algorithm, which I created. You also get stop-loss alerts, you get research articles and insights, you get market commentaries, monthly commentaries and DIY investment lessons, but you also get access to my £50,000 portfolio, which is a portfolio of my own money, which I run live on the site for members to see, and it shows people how I use the service to maximise my returns. And in the first 2 years of doing so, I turned £50,000 into £59,500, which is a 19% return, beating investment managers, professional fund managers, financial advisors, investment banks, passive trackers and the market. So everybody can have a free 30-day trial of 80/20 Investor, and you can claim that by going to moneytothemasses.com and going and clicking on the 80/20 Investor hyperlink at the top of the page. So go and try the service. Let me know what you think of it, and I know from the feedback that you're going to love it. But for now, on with the show.
Okay, so investing and rising interest rates. What do we got on this?
Well, this is a response really just to the current environment that it's slightly topical. I mean, you heard the advert for 80/20 Investor there, but this week I've talked a lot about the rising 10-year US Treasury yield. Now, for those who haven't listened before, it's the yield on the what would be equivalent of the UK gilt. So effectively the loan to the US government. The 10-year version of it, when you invest in it, it's like a bond, that the yield has been going up, and when yields go up on bonds, the way they're priced, you just have to remember that the price of the bond falls. So what we've had is that yield level has started to rise, and if you go back to February when the market sold off, the bond market fell as yields started to rise, but so did the equity market. And the reason why the equity market got kind of spooked is because the yield on that 10-year Treasury is an indicator of the kind of long-term interest rates within the economy. So if that starts to rise, then it puts upward pressure on nearly everything like mortgage rates. And so therefore that starts to limit what consumers can spend because their mortgages go up, and the cost of credit for businesses as well goes up. So it starts to choke the economy. Now, of course, if businesses, they sell things to people, if they can't buy stuff, then their share price starts to fall because their profits are under pressure. We did a whole podcast on it, so if you go back and listen, it's definitely worth a listen, because that started to rise and it's risen way above where it was in February, which spooked the market then. So the market at the moment is largely ignoring the fact that the yield has gone up, and it's now about 3.1%. Now, I was asked the question this week by an 80/20 investor, at which point does that figure, what number does that figure finally cause the equity market to become spooked again? And there's a lot of debate about it. I'm not going to go into it on the podcast because obviously that's for 80/20 investor members. But one of the things I will say is that it automatically is taken as a given that rising yields on bonds will automatically mean that the stock market will crash. That rising 10-year Treasury yield we've become so obsessed with it that it will mean the stock market will crash. There is evidence to show that isn't actually true. Up to a certain number, a certain level, the stock market can rise and has done historically, has rallied until it reached a certain point, which I talked about for 80/20 investor members. So it doesn't have to mean an immediate doom, although it is a bit of a case of can't be smoke without fire, whatever it is. You know what I mean? It's that phrase. So it's kind of a warning signal. So how long can the market ignore it? Now, people often think, well, what will happen? Where could you invest? Does that mean if rates are rising on 10-year Treasuries, does that mean bonds are like a complete no-go? Well, it does make it harder. There are definitely headwinds for bonds if that carries on going, which it could well do, and there are signs to suggest that it might do. But you can still invest in bonds. What it means, you have to invest in ones that have a lower duration. Now, duration is something that is a measure. It's a number that's given to reflect when all the income payments on a bond are due, if that makes sense. So if you get a bond, it's like a loan, so they're paid every, let's say, year into the future, and then you get your money back at the end. That's how a bond works. If a bond has a short duration, so it normally means it has a short period till it's actually ends. So it hasn't got 10 years left to run. It might only have a year. But you can have bonds that have longer than that, but all the income is stacked towards the front. So that actually means that you end up having a shorter duration. The reason why that's a good thing is because as interest rates rise on the longer term 10-year treasury and in the economy, you're going to get your income sooner rather than later. So it's going to be less impacted by the fact that rates are rising and bonds might be falling. So all you've got to think about is you'll see funds that have short duration in their name. It tends to mean they invest in this stuff. So you basically almost think of it like going to the extreme. You want to get your money back as quickly as you can when you invest in bonds in a world where rates go up. So that means you start buying things with shorter duration, typically means shorter maturity. So what happens is you buy the bond and then you get your money back sooner or later. And you'll find funds that just do that. They have shorter duration. And you'll notice the strategic bond funds out there will start to shorten it. If you're interested, go look at a fund fact sheet of a strategic bond fund, and it will tell you on there what the duration of a fund is, and you can normally see how it's changed over time. But it also leads on to this interesting concept of a bond ladder. Now, I'm not going to go into it because we run out of time, but the idea of you buy lots of bonds, you could do individual bonds if you wanted, where they had short duration, but they were staggered. So you might have a 3 month, 6 month, 9 month one or something. So when one matures, you take that money out, and then at that point you reinvest it into another one. And of course the rates in the economy and in bond markets have gone up, so you'll get a better return. So you don't suffer the fall in yields, if that makes sense. You get your money back and then reinvest. A bit like, think of it very simply, just keeping getting your money out and putting it into cash accounts that keep paying you higher and higher interest rates without being locked in for years on end and then having to suffer the fact that you've got a really poor rate. It's kind of like that. People often say gold is a good hedge in an environment like this because if rates go up, it normally means inflation's going up. That's a bit of a myth. If you look at history, there's very little evidence to suggest that gold is great. Gold is just that thing that people buy when they're scared. And I think it was Warren Buffett who once said that if you buy gold today, you're just playing on the fact or hoping that someone's going to be more scared than you are now at some point in the future, therefore pay a higher price. I'm not a fan of gold. I just don't think it really does what it's meant to. Stocks, like I said, can can do quite well. Depends which ones. Banks tend to do better because if you think about it, how do banks make their money? It's on that interest rate differential with savings and loans that they make. And of course, if rates go up, they can boost their profit margins. Currencies tend to come into play because if the rates go up in an economy, then it tends to put up the interest in that currency. Think of it very simply. If the interest rate on the 10-year treasury yield goes up, then the rates generally will probably start going up in the economy. The Fed will probably raise rates as well. It might be a sign of positive growth in the economy. But if the Fed starts to put rates up, then it makes the dollar more attractive. Again, think of it in a kind of incorrect, but like a bank account. Imagine if the rate goes up on a bank account, more people want it, so the dollar becomes more interesting. So you get the dollar rising. So if the rates over in America go up, then the dollar will get stronger typically. And if the dollar gets stronger, then other currencies get weaker, and in particular, emerging market assets and currencies tend to do badly because they have a lot of their liabilities denominated in dollars, but a lot of their assets in emerging market currencies, local currencies. So you imagine their assets almost reduce in value while their liabilities grow bigger. So that's just a kind of a throwaway FYI how things might work out. But what I would say, it's very unusual though at the moment. We're getting periods where bonds, gold, shares are all falling at the same time, all rising at the same time. So the market is a little bit erratic at times, and a lot of that's down to the noise surrounding the headlines to do with trade deals, anything to do with Trump, quite to put it blunt, and obviously central banks and interest rate rises or stopping QE. So you take it all in the round, there are things that you can invest in when rates go up. It just means the environment's a little bit different, and so you just have to look a little bit harder in it. It probably means that it becomes a bit more of a stock pickers game. So therefore, individual fund managers should start to do better than trackers, but we'll see on that one. Anyway, I think that's it, Andy. I'm conscious of the time.
Good stuff. Enjoyed it this week. We've got a couple of bits of admin just to tidy up at the end. We should have done it at the front end. Apologies on that. I'll take responsibility for that. But we've had a lovely review come in by Flash McTavish. And Flash has said, I only started listening a few weeks ago, but already working my way through the back catalogue. Also love the YouTube videos. Great source of information and very well presented. So thank you, Flash McTavish. If you would like to hear your review get read out on this very podcast, we'd love you to nip onto iTunes and provide us a review, and you could be on next week. And if you want to get in touch with Damien and want to have your question featured on next week's show, then do get in touch. It's at Money to the Masses with a number 2. Or you can, of course, email Damien if it's something a little bit longer, and that's damien@moneytothemasses.com. And remember, Damien is Damien.
Good. So until next week, Andy. And don't forget, do get in touch, as Andy said, if you've got questions or topics or anything like that you want to hear on the podcast in the future. So until next week.
Don't forget to claim your free copy of Damien's best-selling book, The 30-Day Money Plan. Sort your finances in just 5 minutes a day, worth $4.99. Just go to moneytothemasses.com/podcast to find out how.